artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, and this is episode 245. My guest today is Paul Reber, professor of psychology at Northwestern University, director of Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience, and head of the Brain, Behavior, and Cognition program, focusing on human memory, how the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves information. His research has significantly advanced our understanding of implicit memory and skill learning. With a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, his work has been cited over 6,000 times. He has served as associate editor for the journal Cortex and contributed to NIH review panels. His recent projects explore applications of memory science in skill training and cognitive aging, and his research aims to translate results in the basic science of learning and memory to practical applications outside the laboratory. So why is it important to AI to study the human brain? Those of you who've been listening for a while won't be in any doubt. Broadly speaking, it's because AI has always been about trying to reproduce something we don't have a good definition of, but we all know it when we see it, which is intelligence, which is an innately human quality, or at least that's where our experience and definitions of it start. So since we know that intelligence is a product of the human brain, then even if we can't understand intelligence as an abstract concept in sufficient detail to recreate it, another approach would be if we could model the human brain with enough fidelity that the model will do the same things that human brains do, one of which is to manifest intelligence. And let's not forget that artificial neural networks share that prefix neuro with neuroscience and were modeled directly on our observations of human brain neurons. So, know thyself is always good advice to follow, right? We're going to talk about distinguishing neuroscience from cognitive neuroscience, the physical structure of the brain, with a brief mention of Sir Roger Penrose, who believes that the brain uses quantum effects to produce cognition, how we learn physical skills, comparing the brain to AI, and foundational problems in neuroscience. So let's get right into the interview. Well, Paul Reber, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. We have so much to talk about in the field of cognitive neuroscience. And we were just talking before we started the recording about that. And I said, well, how do you differentiate cognitive neuroscience from just neuroscience without that label? And I thought that's a good place to start. So can you tell us something about that distinction?
So my colleagues in the neuroscience department kind of start at the neurons. The neuroscience starts with the nerve cells and how they interact. Then you kind of work from the basic structure of a neuron and scale up into circuits and systems and try to understand how those might be involved. If you're interested in human cognitive neuroscience, how those might lead to human behavior. Those of us who call ourselves cognitive neuroscientists kind of usually came at it from the other side, which is questions about human cognition and behavior, and then looking at increasingly more detailed theories and models, realized that grounding these in the systems and circuits of the operation of neurons in the brain would help us understand those things.
Got it. So while neuroscientists might be studying nematode worms, cognitive neuroscientists are occupied with humans. Is that right?
Neuroscientists can study a variety of things, including nematodes, all the way up through primates and also humans. I wouldn't want to say my neuroscience colleagues aren't also studying humans, but neuroscience is a giant field that covers all of that.
So does that put you at the level of studying abstractions more than biology, like systems of the way parts of the brain are connected together and talk to each other?
Yes.
It's kind of a too broad a question to ask how do we break that down. But we're here because the importance of this to AI is that artificial intelligence implies we're making an artificial version of something that happens inside the human brain. And the goal has long been, well, if we can figure out how humans do it, then maybe we can build an electronic analog. And if we start to drill down on that goal, How would we say we ought to approach that lofty goal? What is it we need to understand about the human brain in order to be able to make a copy of it?
Well, I mean, that's really my career of research. I came into the idea of cognitive neuroscience from kind of a computer science AI background and interested in the question of general artificial intelligence. That's a popular buzzword right now, but that idea has been kicking around for a long time, certainly in the 80s and 90s when I was first coming up and learning. And I took classes in what was called AI at the time in the 80s and had the distinct sense that we knew a lot more about the artificial than the intelligence side of that. And so ended up seeing my research go into trying to understand more about human intelligence. I don't think there's a short list of things that we could say we don't know yet about human intelligence. We have approximate theories in a variety of domains that give us some idea of how to describe how humans accomplish various kinds of cognitive tasks. But that's, I think, probably a pretty common approach of people doing cognitive neuroscience is to try to characterize how humans work. When you start caring about the neurons and drilling down to how it works at the level of basic physiology and biology, well, then you do realize that you're kind of in the neighborhood of questions about AI, right? If you can build artificial neural networks and simulated models, then you start having the idea that maybe we can capture some fractions of human intelligence.
And AI has pursued this model of artificial neural networks, modeling neurons sending signals to each other, characterized by activation functions and simple calculations as to whether or not to send outgoing signals, because we thought we saw that happening inside the human brain. Are there other ways in which the human brain performs cognition than neurons sending signals to each other?
No, I think we can say it's just neurons all the way down. And understanding how neurons send these signals to each other is sort of the key question in this.
So that's kind of important because there are people who claim other mechanisms in the brain all the way down to Penrose and quantum kind of effects in the brain. But what you're saying is that if we do the right things with artificial neural networks, we would expect or hope to be able to do everything that the human brain does. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's common for people looking at a problem this hard and this complex to, the phrase that gets used sometimes philosophically is God in the gaps. When there's something you don't understand the mechanism, you don't understand the power of the computational approach, you think, oh, there's got to be something else. It can't all be this.
Yes.
Something you see come up in a lot of complex scientific areas. And sometimes it's true. Sometimes there's a gap and we're like, oh, well, actually, there's something we can't explain. There's something fundamentally non-calculable here. There's no, I think, sense that we've identified any meaningful or important limit to this basic idea that neurons are doing the computation and that our cognitive states are the outcomes of those computations.
Well, and speaking of gaps, and please do ruthlessly correct any misunderstanding of neuroscience that I put out there, the gaps between neurons are filled with glial cells, according to my primitive understanding. Do they play a part in cognition?
The gaps between neurons are synapses. There's vesicles and neurotransmitter in there. Glial cells are involved in some of the other biological upkeep for managing the way the cells are kind of fed by metabolism. There are some people who think there could be some interesting computational ideas going on in glial cells. There are things that are affecting basic biology and metabolism that depend heavily on glial cells. There's more than one kind of neuron in the brain. Exactly what neurons are doing what calculation, I think, is something we're seeing advance. Pyramidal cells are the ones people like to focus on the most. There's a lot of Purkinje cells in the cerebellum that are probably doing interesting things as well. But I would say, as we advance our understanding of how these different kinds of cells interact, and we say, oh, you know what, it's not just pyramidal cells, but they're in sort of a synergistic interaction with some of these other metabolic processes, that wouldn't be different from saying cognition emerges from the computations. That would be an example of advancing our understanding of what those computations are and exactly how they are. I mean, the cells themselves are built out of proteins that are interacting in interesting and complex ways. DNA's in the cell body, things are moving up and down the axons. There's a lot of activity happening within a cell. I mean, at some level, that's why neuroscience is such a big and interesting field. There's so much to understand about a single neuron, right? And so people in neuroscience are just trying to get a handle on what are all these proteins doing? Where did they come from? How did they get folded? How did they emerge from the functioning of DNA? There's a lot of work to do there. And so it's a different kind of science and different kind of work that people are doing compared to those of us who are coming from a top down and saying, I want to understand how memory works. What are the key systems in the brain? What are the key learning mechanisms that are extracting structure from the world? How is that reflected and changing in synaptic strengths around the brain? It's a world of different kinds of questions.
At a very high level, the field of cognitive neuroscience, I want to compare this to cosmology, where we have big open questions, some of which get resolved and then open up more questions. We had questions like, is the universe open or closed? And what is dark matter, dark energy? And often there's this sense that every time we answer one question, 10 more pop up. And sometimes you can think that we're not making any headway. We're actually revealing more ignorance the more we expand our knowledge. What in cognitive neuroscience are the biggest unanswered questions? And what I'm trying to get at here is, what is the sense of how well solved, how much we understand the functioning of the human brain? What are the big challenges? And when do we think that we might get a handle of those? Or do people feel like this is one of those things where we'll never reach the bottom?
I think there's a sense that someday we could reach the bottom. I wouldn't share the opinion that that's imminent. I would think it's even hard to make a robust list of the biggest questions. I think the one you probably get most likely as an answer, and it's interesting, it's not that far from my work, but maybe not the one that I would personally be most interested in, but like, how does the subjective experience of consciousness emerge from the mass action of neural computations around the brain? That's one we can articulate. That's a big one we don't really understand, sort of an emergence.
The hard problem.
But there's a lot of basic questions. I mean, I guess kind of related to that. I mean, most of my work is learning and memory. We don't really understand how the system of the brain updates to experience to make you remember things from yesterday or better at things that you're practicing and becoming more skilled at. But I think we could ask, sort of frame similar questions in a lot of the other sort of big cognitive domains like perception, attention. How do these fundamental processes emerge from the neural computations? Is the foundational questions are still kind of there, exactly how these things emerge. And so I think the sense is it's solvable, but like I said, not imminent. It's not happening. But I think the sense of like science should have an endpoint. We come up with a description that's done, I think is pretty rare. I mean, almost everything that we put our scientific effort at, the more we understand, the more there is to understand. And that doesn't mean we're not making progress. That means we are making progress as we open up new questions. And so, I think if you wanted to make the analogy back to cosmology, the people studying the sort of basic shape of the universe and what evidence we can infer about dark matter and dark energy, they get really excited when there's something they can't quite explain yet, because that would say, aha, that's where the new physics is coming from. That's where the next big ideas are coming from. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that means they think it's never going to be solved. They just realize there's a long way to go. And every time you identify a mystery and then make it a little less mysterious, that's what scientific progress looks like.
Mm. What are the things that you can't explain that get you excited?
My work, I said, is on learning and memory. We do a lot of work on skill learning. I want to understand better how we get better when we practice. Do something, and then you do it again. You're a little faster, you're a little bit more accurate. Something's changed in the state of your brain. We have ideas about statistical extraction of experience that leads to reorganization of neural networks so that you get better. However, that's a little bit too broad a description. There's got to be both limiting factors, things that make certain kinds of learning harder or bound the use of your extracted knowledge. There's also going to be some cleverness in the way that that's done. Understanding exactly how that can be pulled out of experience is something we're still getting a handle on. This is an area where some of the work that we spend a lot of time thinking about in the lab starts to touch on some of the findings coming out of AI. I was just teaching a graduate seminar in computational methods next quarter, in the spring quarter. I'm thinking it'd be a good time to go back with the students to kind of talk a little bit about some of the history of some of the neural network models and connectionism. A lot of that work was getting done in the 80s and 90s when I was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University, the Parallel Distributed Processing Group. Jeff Hinton's work was all over the place there. Jay McClellan was our kind of local leader, getting people to think about these neural networks. And it was a long time ago. We hadn't had the big LLM breakthroughs. In fact, I was talking to Jay, that was a while ago, and I was like, how do we not see it coming? Like, we all thought these computational mechanisms were powerful, but we didn't see the big insights that came out later in image processing and then in language processing. There was a lot of theoretical ideas that these computational mechanisms were powerful enough to apply to those domains, but something kind of magic happened more recently as more data, bigger computational systems, more power were brought to bear. And, a lot of those ideas are like, oh yeah, we thought we could pull a lot of language structure out of the statistical experience of what people see in the world around them. And then when ChatGPT showed up, you're like, what? Yes, we can. Those mechanisms are powerful. I got interested in those mechanisms at that time because I thought those are doing something like what I thought was important in certain kinds of skill learning. Language can be thought of as a skill, though mostly I was thinking about things in problem solving, motor sequences. And what we see humans doing is sort of, I think, in that sort of neighborhood, though constrained by the biology of the human brain. We only have so many neurons doing so much work. We can only experience our experiences at the right time throws them at us. And so once you get it in a big neural network running on large computational servers, you can actually crank the computations a little faster. And then you start seeing some of those really impressive discoveries coming out of those systems.
And given the ability of AI, whether it's generative AI or AI that's been around somewhat longer, that is predictive and able to do things like unsupervised learning, and its ability to find patterns in things, what's the utility of that in your research in figuring out things about how the brain works?
Well, I think the main thing is it's sort of at a pretty kind of high level of abstraction, which is it just puts a marker down on how powerful the math is and says, no, you can really solve some hard problems. So one of the debates throughout my research career has been how much of what humans learn can be described with these kind of mechanisms, and where do we need more recognizably symbolic computations that look a little bit more like how people think through problems. There was a parallel push that was happening around the same time when I was in graduate school, again, back late 80s, early 90s. There was some work being done in this connectionist world, but there was a lot more work being done in symbolic kinds of AI. And at that time, I think the smart money was on the really clever people working in these symbolic AI systems were going to make real progress. There was work being done at that time trying to figure out how to make self-driving cars. I mean, that's not a new idea. It's been a battle going on for many decades. And the thought was we should make it look more like a computer where we write out, well, if this happens, then we're going to do that. And here are the situations. And it just turned that kind of symbolic calculation just turns out to be really hard. I think the sort of sense of how powerful these sort of more automatic, statistical, unsupervised learning kinds of algorithms all really deriving out of these sort of artificial neural networks was this computation can do a lot of heavy lifting for us. And I would say now the sort of challenge is, all right, well, how do we pull these together? And I would say at this point, the human brain then becomes a useful thing to look at if you're interested in AI, which is you can't quite do everything with the pure statistical learning models. But we've also seen that trying to build the symbolic systems that calculate everything don't quite work. The systems are just fundamentally different ways of handling information and aggregating, accumulating, using information together. But our brains are doing that. We have systems that are quite obviously symbolic, as we can express is part of our human cognition. But we also have a lot of implicit sort of statistical learning that's happening at the same time. And how the brain manages to integrate and use both these together, I don't know, some level, maybe I would say that is sort of what currently excites me about the kind of work that we're doing. Like, can we look at how humans are learning to do things in the world and get some ideas about how those are integrated? And maybe some days that matters for how people are trying to take what we can get out of these LLMs and get the next step to do something truly creative and different, not just kind of parrot back the statistics of the input.
You've given me a lot of thoughts and things to talk about there. And talking about the symbolic processing and the expert systems that you were referring to of the 90s, when we thought if we can only think of everything in advance that a computer needs to do and program that in, it will be able to handle anything. And as you say, we've moved on to this new paradigm where we get these emergent effects from making really big models. And I want to relate this to learned behavior in humans, just because I'm reminded that I'm slowly learning pickleball, and every time I go, someone points out something else that I need to learn. Like last time it was, you need to move to the ball, then stop, then hit it, and not try and hit it while you're moving. And I'm repeating to myself over and over to try and change the behavior. I'm going, move, stop, hit to myself. And this is something that I have to do consciously. At some point, that will, like the previous things I have learned, become unconscious, and then it will be effective because it has to happen much faster than me saying that to myself. So that is, I think, Kahneman's system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And how do cognitive neuroscientists think about that distinction of conscious versus instinctive learned behavior?
Well, that's really kind of exactly what we study in my lab. Our idea is that you have something that works like the learning mechanism in LLM that's just running in your brain all the time. Everything you do is getting practiced. The statistics of your experience are getting basically just sort of encoded directly into your neurons. And that's creating that intuitive, instinctual, kind of fast and acting system. But that system just gets better at whatever you practice. And so, as you said, one of the things you'll discover in a skill learning context, pickleball being one, or any other kind of skill learning, is you might have a bad habit or a sequence or procedure that isn't doing what you want. And then you might get some outside influence. And then it says, okay, you're going to have to use this trick to kind of guide what you're doing. And I think we would call that sort of outside instruction sort of where the symbolic ideas come in. That's or a top-down processing. You know what you're supposed to do, and then what you're doing is you're repeating yourself as you do is you're trying to retrain this sort of the bottom-up process to create this new habit, create this new instinct of executing that. And that's one example, and I think a lot of the sort of physical sort of sports are places where we can really see that very clear interaction that, somebody gives you some advice that you use in this top-down way to try to guide your practice so that you sharpen up this sort of fast kind of bottom-up procedures that you're using. So that fits, I think, a bit in the sort of system 1, system 2 of Kahneman and Tversky. Another model, this is sort of a different descriptive term for this, actually also comes out of Anders Ericsson's work. He's sort of the person kind of famously associated with 10,000 hours, though he personally did not like that framing. He claimed that was Gladwell's misrepresentation of his work. But he had a phrase he called deliberate practice, and it really meant to capture the same idea. And what he was pushing back on there was the idea that you could just train yourself bottom-up practice over and over again. And we had a quote we used to keep around the lab, a famous football quote that said, maybe Vince Lombardi said it, but practice makes permanent, not perfect. That whatever you practice over and over, you'll just get better at. And so Anders Ericsson's deliberate practice was an idea that a coach coming in and giving you a heuristic like you had about stop before you swing, move, stop, swing, is going to be critical for real development of skill, and that has to interact with whatever you're doing through practice. But most of the people who've talked about these kinds of frameworks haven't actually, in my opinion, focused very much on what's happening in that practice side. So what's going on as you just run yourself through that procedure, move, stop, swing, move, stop, swing? How many times does it take? Exactly how rich is that representation? Does it matter where you are at your balance point? Does it matter where your other, arms or limbs are? Does it matter where the other players on the court are? How is that information extracted? How precise is it? How generalizable is it to other contexts? A lot of what we've been studying in my lab is trying to come up with paradigms where we can identify the operating characteristics of that learning process, that sort of repetition-driven learning process. With the idea that we need to know the strengths and weaknesses of that system so that we can better understand how it interacts with sort of the deliberate side, the outside instruction. Some of the outside instruction, some of it's inside. Sometimes you're doing it, you discover, oh, wait a minute, actually, if I can start my backswing a little earlier, that's going to help me. But that's still going to come through this kind of top down. You're going to have to then train yourself and guide your behavior. And that's just relying on a whole different set of neural systems in the brain than the sort of bottom up, just get better by hammering it out over and over again.
How much does the role of the brain in managing our physiology and biology affect the way that you study it? I mean, we evolved to run around the savannah and hunt things or harvest things. We didn't evolve to do algebra. That came later. And so the brain interacts with our physiology, not just for learning pickleball and how to drive a car, but it goes down to levels that, again, correct me where I'm wrong on this, regulate autonomous functions of the human body and is doing things like we have semi-conscious control of our breathing. It happens when we're not focused on it, but we can change it consciously. So it looks superficially to me as though there's some sort of continuum here in that we've been talking about how I can consciously affect physical reactions in terms of how I play pickleball or something else. And there may be this continuum going from very conscious, symbolic processing levels down to very primitive physical levels. And I suppose the different structures of the brain and the limbic brain and things like that would also come into that. How much of a continuum is that? How does differentiating those different functions come into the work of figuring out what the brain does?
Well, we sort of normally bound our work as sort of being cortical. It's got to be in the cortex of the brain. So things like pushing into breathing in, some of the things are going to push down brainstem and sort of deeper. And I would say one of the reasons we look a little less at that is that the idea is there's a little less plasticity in that system. So, we're learning in memory lab, we're looking for how things are going to change over time. It's a lot of plasticity in cortical connections. So if we come up and talk about the sort of question of what we're doing for control and choice in the motor system and the motor planning system, I think that's where we would look for where where we would direct our attention, where we think the interesting questions are for things like in the sort of pickleball description. So at some point, there's a kind of effectively a motor program for how to execute a move on the pickleball court that you can just sort of let run and sort of feel that that's intuitive, kind of automatic, habitual. But then you also have the sort of cognitive control to step in from the top and say, okay, no, we're not just going to run on that. We're going to do it this way this time to try to train this new procedure. At some point, the fact that we can choose between those two indicates we have a fair amount of control over that process, and we can make a conscious decision for which way we want to run the system on this particular shot. How we decide which system we're going to run and how that control kind of hands off is pushing into questions we don't have answers to. We don't really know how the decision between the two is made. In cases where it's really obvious, like, okay, I know I'm doing it wrong, I don't practice to get it right, but there's probably a lot more subtle interaction that's happening on a more routine basis that requires some interesting computational ideas to be happening. And so I would say, we're looking a lot at what's happening in these kinds of systems. The motor system becomes a good one for studying this and for describing it. But as you mentioned, extrapolating it to ideas like doing algebra, one of our hypotheses, and I would say this hypothesis, though, I think it's a good place to start, is to say whatever mechanism is honing these motor programs, these sequence of motor actions, probably operates in the frontal lobes, the other higher order cognition areas of the brain, to organize cognitive sequences. So things like working through geometry proofs, algebra problems, playing chess. Chess is another great example of a cognitive domain where we can see a lot of both top-down and bottom-up. Chess players are amazingly good at pattern recognition. If you've watched the best players play, they play so fast. If you want to put it back in the sort of Kahneman Tversky, it's clearly very system one. It's very automatic. They're playing too quickly to be cognitive. But there's a lot of deep cognition that's also happening in chess that's sort of interacting with that. And that the actual achievement of the top players is some combined output of those two kinds of knowledge. But we think that that framework applies to all sorts of abstract human thought. We think it's there in language. We think it's there in mathematical computations. We think it's there in other kinds of cognitive areas. So we kind of start with the idea that there's some learning mechanism that's reorganizing circuits to make you better at it. It's easy to see and quantify in the motor domain. We do a lot of work with simple motor sequence learning because we can watch the learning process very rapidly. But we think that that mechanism generalizes out to a wide range of human cognitive abilities.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. Next half, next week. We discussed Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking there. And it's worth reading his book, titled Thinking Fast and Slow, about System 1 thinking, which is intuitive, fast, pattern-matching type thinking, and System 2, which is slower, logical, analytical reasoning. Lots of parallels and crossovers into AI and computing there. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, researchers at Stanford University used an OpenAI LLM to model the behavior of about 1,000 individuals by putting 1,052 recruits through a 2-hour interview each with the voice-enabled version of GPT-4o. The AI was given a general script to follow, but also instructed to listen to the answers in real time and adapt its questions as needed, asking participants for the story of their life and views on societal issues. The researchers then fed an AI-generated transcript of each interview into a different instance of GPT-4o and asked the model to imitate each person. The bottom line was that the imitation humans were 85% accurate at answering follow-up questions as though they were the actual humans themselves. This was significantly better than previous approaches to creating synthetic human responses for social studies. Lead researcher Jun-Sung Park said, "We didn't quite know what we were expecting. It was a nice scientific validation." Just a periodic reminder, please do give us a like, or a thumbs up, or a wave, or whatever signifies approval on your podcasting platform of choice, and even better, a nice review. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Paul Reber, when we'll talk about how to memorize something like a TED Talk, the difference between human and computer memory, how humans make memories more resilient, catastrophic interference, and just how big is the human brain, and can we fill it up? That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.